Welcome everybody to our event. We're super pleased to have you joining us. It's fantastic. Um, for those of you who don't know, I do know a lot of you from the list, but for those of you that I don't know, my name is Emily Setty. I'm from Surrey University, and I'm here with Laura. Laura, you can introduce yourself if you want.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. My name's Laura Knott, and I'm the schools project manager at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. So I've been working with Emily for the past 3.5, nearly 4 years now on the project that we're going to be talking to you about today. So it's a real privilege to be here.
Yeah, super exciting that we're going to be able to share the findings from this project and some of the arguments that we're making off the back of it in terms of safeguarding within schools when it comes to this issue of harmful sexual behaviour. And Laura will be explaining more about how the project worked and its context and what we found. And then I'll be thinking from that perspective on some of what we might want to take away from it, both in terms of our thinking about this issue and then also practically what we might want to be doing in our various settings to take it forward. So, without further ado, as they say, I'll hand over to Laura so she can start taking us through what we found across the schools and the challenges and the experiences that Laura had working with the schools. And then, yeah, I'll be coming back to what some of these findings might mean for culture and everyday practice with safeguarding. So, yeah, over to you, Laura.
Lovely. Thank you, Emily. Can I move the slides on, or do I need to ask you? I need to ask you too, don't I?
Yeah,
Or you?
sorry, I think you have to ask me. Yeah.
Yes. The next slide, then, please, Emily. Oh, it brings back memories of COVID, doesn't it? It's horrible. So, I think most of you will be aware of the kind of context that led to a real spotlight in recent years on the issue of harmful sexual behaviour in schools. We had a young woman called Samasara who in 2020 posted on Instagram about her personal experiences of sexual violence and harassment in schools. And a little bit like the hashtag Me Too movement that was happening at a similar time, that post went viral and she got hundreds and thousands of responses from young people who were talking about their experiences at school. So she set up the Everyone's Invited website to chronicle those testimonies, and then set up the Everyone's Invited charity to tackle rape culture in schools. And I think probably for you as frontline educators and researchers, you were well aware of the scale of the issue. But with all this so huge number of young people responding to Everyone's Invited, it really prompted a big cross-government response in different departments like policing and court. But especially of interest to us was the Ofsted Rapid Review in 2021. And so that first point that you see there is a quote from the report that they published in June 2021, where Ofsted concluded that unfortunately, harmful sexual behaviour is so widespread in schools that it must be addressed for all children and young people, even where there are no specific reports. So, in other words, every school behave as though this is happening because it is, even if you don't know about it. We know that there are many reasons why young people won't report harmful sexual behaviour, and we'll go into some of those later. So this was quite a sort of mark in the sand, really, of Ofsted and the Department for Education really shining this spotlight on the issue. And I think most schools that I've spoken to welcome that focus, but also recognise that although there's a very unique and vital role that schools can play in managing harmful sexual behaviour, they can't do it by themselves. So schools found themselves in this kind of new climate where there was a real push to focus on this and there was high accountability demanded, but there wasn't a corresponding match of resourcing or training or time. And so that led to quite an increase in emotional pressure. This work has always been emotionally demanding and complex, but I think it was a bit of a perfect storm with more focus, more priority, more pressure, not any more time, not any more training, not any more resources. So schools started to call our helpline at the Stop It Now helpline at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, telling us that they were feeling quite isolated in dealing with this, feeling on the front line, but that systems felt a little bit broken around them, so that they were often left picking up the pieces. And students were telling us that they had a real kind of patchwork response in when they were talking to staff about this. Sometimes they got a fantastic response and they felt really heard and really safeguarded, and other times they felt dismissed or not believed, or like telling someone made the situation worse. So we knew that to really effectively safeguard in this area in managing and preventing harmful sexual behaviour, we've got to try and shift our focus from looking at all the problems and all the things that can go wrong. We need to understand those and we need to understand the risks, but we need to move towards looking at relationships. We need to establish that climate of safety in a school so that young people can tell us what's really going on for them. And we need to listen to their experiences because they are the experts of their experiences. And when we do that, when we know what students are facing, we can then work in a much more strategic way with parents, because we can say to them, this is what your children care about, this is what we care about, this is what you care about, let's all join together. And then also the same for multi-agency partnerships as well. When we know that live intelligence of what young people are facing, it gives us much more shared vocabulary with other agencies who are no doubt also seeing similar issues as well. Next slide, please, Emily. So, what we did in response to this increased focus on the issue and what we were hearing from staff and students was, first of all, establish the collaboration that you can see today, working with Emily from the University of Surrey in partnership with us at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. And we looked to see how could we try and build an evidence base to help schools know what works in this space, because we know that education professionals do not have the time to test and evaluate and monitor different interventions to see what works. We needed to do that on behalf of schools. So we approached our funders, the KPMG Foundation, and they gave us a 3-year action research grant that started, it ran across calendar years, January to December. So we started year one in January 2022 and we finished the work in December 2024. And it was a joy of a project. We were able to work with 30 Midlands-based secondary schools, and we worked really hard to make sure that we got a very diverse range of schools represented, because when we shared our findings, we wanted any setting to be able to pick up that learning and recognise their own setting in there. We didn't want anybody to feel left out, really. So we got a really lovely balance of mainstream, special schools, independent, PRUs, girls' schools, boys' schools, faith schools, so that hopefully our learning is really generalisable and applicable in lots and lots of different settings. Our aims were to work with schools, not to go in as though we were the experts with all of the answers, but to actually go in and find out what questions schools were facing, what issues they were facing, and try and deal with some of those questions together, try and find some of the answers in partnership with schools and parents and students. And we did it in a real kind of mixture of methods. We basically went into schools and did initial visits, formulated a engagement plan that was bespoke to each school, and planned interventions to address the issues that those schools had identified. And that was a whole range of different interventions, such as staff training, reviewing RSE curriculums, working with students to establish really good student voice mechanisms, working with parents, providing supervision support to safeguarders. Whatever the school needed, really, we would try to do what we thought would address it well. And if we couldn't do it, then we'd work in partnership with other organisations, such as the University of Worcester for Bystander Education and the Protective Behaviours Consortium. So our goal overall was to help schools to respond really well to incidents of harmful sexual behaviour, to learn from all of the schools and share that learning as widely as possible, and ultimately to prevent harmful sexual behaviour in schools by making safeguarding more relational, more early intervention and prevention, and ethically grounded. Next slide, please, Emily. So the challenge I'm sure I don't need to you could all tell us this much more clearly, I think, because a lot of you will be facing this, but the challenges schools became really quite stark, I think. The safeguarding leads that we were speaking to and the pastoral staff were telling us that they were feeling quite an intense level of pressure. Um, they recognise the high stakes environment and they really care about getting it right and really worry about getting it wrong. And so that kind of push and pull of feeling, am I doing the right thing here? Have I done enough? Have I done it at the right time? Is this child going to be safe this evening? Can I leave the building? Do I need to call in with somebody? Can I check in with them? Will they be here tomorrow? Those kind of questions result in a real level of emotional intensity. As we mentioned, educators really feel on the front line because often, even if the thresholds for statutory services involvement are met, once that involvement's finished, if a police investigation's concluded or children's social care involvement ends, it's the school who are left picking up the pieces, both with the child who's displayed the harmful behaviour and the child who's been harmed, and the parents who often want very different things, and the community fallout, and perhaps media and social media fallout as well. So all of that leads to really high levels of fear, guilt and doubt and real concern about getting it right. As we said, students often face a lot of barriers to reporting harmful sexual behaviour. Big one is they're learning, right? They're students, they're teenagers, and they haven't necessarily yet fully formed their views of what's okay and what's not okay. So do they recognise it as harmful sexual behaviour? Do they know what's happened to them? They'll know it doesn't feel right, but do they have the words to articulate what harm has been done? Do they feel like they'll be believed? Do they feel like they're so ashamed of what's happened and they're blaming themselves that they could even dare to tell an adult? Do they fear that there won't be any action, or do they fear the opposite, that there'll be really strong action and that might cause things to spiral? Lots of students told us we could speak to our safeguarding leads and we do like them, we do trust them, but we know they've got to pass it on and we're scared about what happens after that. We're scared about what happens when it goes outside of school. And that was a really real and understandable fear, I think. So all of these factors mean that safeguarding practice can sometimes become more about the procedure and understandably working through to check we've done everything. Have we recorded it? Have we reported it? Have we done everything that we need to do in the guidance? Have we got a zero tolerance approach? And all of that can sometimes come at the cost of the trust and the dialogue and the care with students. And that's nobody's fault because everybody's trying to do the best. But the sad situation we saw were DSL safeguarding leads who were feeling under a lot of pressure and worrying about whether they were getting it right and really caring and wanting to get it right on one hand, and then students who wanted to talk to their trusted adults in their lives but weren't quite sure where it would go and didn't know if it was the right thing to do to tell people. So neither students or staff were really feeling fully served by the current models and the current procedures. So I just want to give you a couple of minutes. As we've been talking, perhaps you've recognised and resonated with some of that. So a couple of questions to reflect on just quietly. If you might want to just think, or you might want to jot some thoughts down. Which aspects of your safeguarding practice bring clarity and confidence? So where do you feel happy and in balance with your safeguarding practice? And which areas still feel uncertain or perhaps emotionally difficult to navigate? It is 17 minutes past 4, so I'll just give us till 20 past to think about that. Just that bit of time to stop and pause and reflect. So for people just joining us, you've not lost your sound. We're just having a moment of reflection at that question at the bottom of the screen there. Which aspects of your safeguarding practice bring clarity and confidence, and which still feel uncertain or emotionally difficult to navigate? And we're just going to do that for another minute or two to give you a chance to think and perhaps jot down some thoughts just privately. Okay, just bringing us back together then. I hope just that moment to reflect was useful. And I'll ask Emily for the next slide, please. Thank you. So our findings across the 3 years, as you can imagine, were incredibly rich and wide and deep, and we can't do it fully justice in an hour, but we will attempt to do our best. I think we should start by saying how grateful we were to the schools, parents, staff, and students about their honesty and their openness. I think maybe I went in expecting that schools might want to present the best foot forward and show how well that they were doing, and they were doing really well. But also, schools were incredibly open and frank about how difficult a lot of this stuff is, and that meant we could have some really honest conversations, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. So the themes that kind of emerged across the 3 years, there was a real trajectory where we began in year one, and it was all about identifying the issues, really. There was some confusion amongst staff and between staff and students about what actually counts as harmful sexual behaviour. Is that harmful? Is that inappropriate? Is it sexualised language? Does that count? Is that harmful sexual behaviour? And quite a gap between the way students and staff perceived what constitutes harmful sexual behaviour. So there was a bit of work to do there about actually recognising what is harmful sexual behaviour and getting staff, students, and parents on a similar kind of page about what that actually looks like. And then in year two, just quite organically, actually, we started to move towards a kind of mid phase of growth where we were finding ways to build stronger partnerships with parents and multi-agency partnerships and collaboration. And schools were starting to say that they were feeling a bit more supported and not quite as alone. And then in the final and third year, we saw a real move towards strength-based, restorative, and participatory practice. So, schools saying to us, we don't want to have the conversations about toxic masculinity. We need to reframe this. We want to move towards positive masculinity conversations. So, moving away from that over focus on harm and dangers and risks, and in a really healthy way, I think, towards strengths and healthy relationships and what they look like. So the promising practice that we identified was around protective behaviours as an approach to personal safety. We delivered that to staff for them to use with students, and we got really positive feedback about that. Reframing that conversation from toxic to positive masculinity and focusing on rewarding positive masculinity behaviours and focusing on positive male role models. Bystander education, so helping students know what's okay and what's not okay and what they can do about it, when to intervene, when is it safe to intervene, and when to involve an adult. Restorative responses, so helping students reflect on what's happened and what they all need to feel safe again. Really meaningful student voice that's embedded and the feedback loop is closed. That's one of the things that we've really found made a difference, where students can see not only they're being asked the questions, but their answers are being heard, their answers are being passed on, and changes happen as a result of that information. So the school environment changes, or policies and procedures change, or the uniform policy changes. And that's where we saw student voice become really powerful and meaningful. Next slide, please, Emily. Last one from me is just a quick case study about where we saw some great practice around young people leading in safeguarding. And this school were really open to working with students and really keen to capture their real life experiences and their voices. And so what we came up with for this school was that we would do an after school club where we asked students to come along to do creative activities that they enjoyed, whatever that might be. We provide the resources, they just need to come and provide their creativity. And we asked the simple question, what one thing would you change to feel safer in school? And they just led on lots of different initiatives to try and answer that question creatively first and then practically. And what we heard back from staff about that was that they saw that students really got a voice through this club, and they heard things that they would never have heard in other contexts, and they felt like they really understood the students' experiences on a much deeper level. There were really valuable insights that came from peer dynamics and the school environments. Students were telling us exactly where they felt safe and didn't feel safe, and exactly who they felt safe with and didn't feel safe with. And that could inform the staff reflection and planning and hotspot mapping and even the layout of classrooms and the layout of the school buildings. And so before I pass back to Emily, just give you a minute or so just to think about how these kind of low stakes youth-led spaces in your individual setting might reveal insights that adults, I can't see that last bit, is it sometimes might miss otherwise, I think it is, isn't it? That adults might miss in other ways. So could that work in your school, that after school club type thing, or is there something else that you could think of that might allow that safe informal space for those more meaningful conversations to take place? And I'll stop talking now and hand over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Laura. I hope that has all provided a bit of insight into what was done and what was found. While you're reflecting on this last point about the implications, I will take us through some of our interpretation of what we found and what it might mean in terms of your practice in schools and elsewhere, depending on the settings that you're in. And I think both Laura and I agreed that what we found was that the schools that made the biggest progress stopped treating harmful sexual behaviour as just a matter of incidents to manage, and instead started thinking about it in terms of the wider culture that can be shaped within the school. As Laura has indicated, some of the early responses that we encountered were often quite reactive, and these measures can feel very decisive in their own way, but whether or not they change the underlying culture that sits underneath the issues is somewhat questionable. And as Laura's outlined, it's that experimentation with more preventative and relational approaches that deal with not just what is the harm, but what would healthy relationships look like? What are the strengths that young people already possess and maybe need to develop in order to enable them to meet their relational needs and to engage with their peer group cultures, but in that healthy and positive way, predicated on empathy and respect. So, in other words, not just what should they not be doing, but what needs are those behaviours meeting, and how in a more positive way can they meet those needs? All of those ideas that come from that theorising around why people might behave in harmful ways towards others. So it's all about that shift from trying to control young people to trying to collaborate with them and develop that idea of fairness and consistency and care. And we're going to explore this a little bit more. And this idea of domains of safeguarding brings to life some of what we're trying to argue for here. This, of course, isn't something that we have just invented. It has been written about for some time. And the idea is that every decision that we make in safeguarding operates across one, two, or three of these domains. So the production domain is the procedural side of safeguarding, the policies that are in place, the record keeping, the referrals, the compliance side with all of those procedures. It's the bit that's really important to ensure accountability and consistency. The explanation domain is about understanding and meaning making. So, how we interpret the behaviour that we see in young people, the narratives that we construct about them, how we make sense of the context that young people are operating within. And then the aesthetics level is the relational and ethical dimension. It's how our safeguarding actions feel to those involved. How does our tone communicate or not care, fairness, and respect to the people at the receiving end of that safeguarding? And of course, all three of these domains are vital. If we only rely on procedure, we can become robotic in what we do. But if we only rely on more empathetic ways of approaching it, we might become inconsistent. So it's about balanced practice that hold these domains together so that we can be both compliant and compassionate, structured and reflective. And this related concept of safe uncertainty, again, not something we have invented, but it helps us ground the framework in a balanced way. It's an idea borrowed from systemic family therapy. And if we apply it to safeguarding, it's about thinking through how adults can hold both clarity and curiosity together. So Laura was talking, wasn't she, about some of what we found about adults that approached safeguarding with young people, wanting to learn from them and then adapting in response to what they hear. And this framework might be a helpful way of thinking a little bit more about that. Safe uncertainty is about sitting in the middle of those overly rigid and overly inconsistent responses, enabling the safeguarders to be confident and reflective and decisive when they need to be, but through dialogue. And importantly, it recognises that we can never remove all risk or all moral ambiguity around the decisions that we might be making in safeguarding, but we can create a safeguarding culture of trust, dialogue, and ethical reasoning, and that culture can sit underneath our decision making. And actually, when educators, safeguarders model that to young people, saying this is a really complex situation here that has unfolded, let's think through together the responses that are available to us. And that shows young people and those around young people that safeguarding is something that is done collaboratively, not imposed from the top down. So like I say, the core idea is about holding both clarity and curiosity. Through clarity, we have firm boundaries, we follow lawful procedure, and we have predictable responses that people can rely on. But curiosity keeps us open to the unique contexts, meanings, emotions, and developmental needs at play that might, be brought to us through an incident. So in day-to-day terms, it means that we're going to act promptly on the risk, but then also give ourselves time to pause and ask, what happened? Why did it happen? And how is everybody involved affected by it? Not just the students involved directly in the incident, but also other students within the environment and the safeguarders and other educational professionals themselves within that environment too. It means that we follow all of the statutory requirements, but also give the effort to communicate why we're taking particular actions to build that understanding and trust. And we're naming the harm and upholding the boundaries around the harm and having that kind of quick response, but then also making sure that we're carving out that time for genuine learning, repair, and reintegration. So it's not just that this is harmful and wrong, and here is the action we're taking to kind of shut it down, but also how do we create spaces for that learning, for understanding, okay, what needs were being met here, how were people affected, and how might we want to grow and do things differently next time in that more positive and empowering way. And that's why this isn't about being soft or indecisive. It's disciplined. it's focused on safety. What does it mean to be safe? To create safety in the short term in response to an incident, but also what it means to create safety in that longer term. And to do that longer term work, we have to be open-minded about how we make sense of what has gone on. And again, to keep reiterating that idea of creating safety over the longer term through ensuring that young people feel that safeguarding is being done with them, not to them. And we hope that for staff, this can start improving their confidence because, yes, their decisions might procedurally be correct, but there is also that opportunity to figure out whether they are ethically grounded. And there is that space for reflection and rationalization on that broader point. So something for you to take forward in terms of reflection is thinking about your setting and where maybe is there that reliable clarity in place, the certainty part of the piece, reporting routes, thresholds, and so on. But where could we also invite a little more curiosity, those restorative conversations, that student voice informing policy? So, okay, we can operationalize all of this through our 3 domains of practice: production, explanation, and aesthetics. So our responses to HSB should be this quick audit across these domains. Production: have we recorded, assessed risk, acted lawfully and consistently? Who needs to be informed and when? Explanation: do students and parents understand what happened and why our response looked a certain way? Are we naming the norms, the impacts, and the expectations clearly? And then aesthetics: how does the response feel to those involved? And in that regard, maybe we have to ask them and engage with that student voice, with that parent voice as well, as the case may be. So the 6 R's, which you can find out about more if you read the report that we'll share. Hopefully some of you have seen it already, but we will flag it at the end of the session, and that provides a bit more of a deeper dive into how to do this process in a kind of structured way, balancing that sequence of stabilizing safety first, creating then a space to make sense of what's gone on, and attending to that relational tone that we are imparting. To make some of this balance, become a bit more sensical and applied for you all, we're going to work through 4 scenarios that map perhaps some of the common pitfalls that might be in place when we're trying to respond, and then how we might want to build on that to show how the domains work together. So, okay, our first one is a Year 9 student discloses that a peer sent them a sexual image. The DSL follows the procedure, logging the incident, informing parents and reporting, and then a whole school assembly on the legal risks of image sharing follows. So in theory, the DSL has done everything right procedurally. Can't quibble with that. It's exemplary compliance, really strong in that production domain. But what might be missing? It's this explanation and aesthetic domain. Where is the conversation about how and why the behaviour occurred? Thinking about the assembly here, what about the students' embarrassment? And then suddenly an assembly is being done on the topic, and people might know, oh, it's because of that incident involving these particular students. What about the relational repair between the students involved and maybe any wider young people within the student body who became involved? So what we see here in the response is safe certainty. Safe because it follows the rules, but rigid and potentially quite alienating. And students might experience this safeguarding response as something punitive rather than supportive. Are they going to want to make a disclosure again? A more balanced approach might involve adding on that quiet follow-up conversation, a more restorative discussion, or integrating reflection into PSHE rather than this kind of quick win whole school assembly. So it really becomes about that opportunity for deep learning, not shame or embarrassment or alienation, or, at best, students just switching off in the assembly and not really engaging. Our second example is a serious allegation circulating on social media, and senior leaders in the school act very swiftly. Again, an assembly on online misconduct. They write letters to parents about, what young people should be doing and what the rules are, and they tighten the phone use policies within the school. And these actions are all framed as safeguarding and accountability, decisive, visible, protective. Yet the atmosphere in the school perhaps becomes tense, fearful. Again, maybe some of that reactionary, reaction from the students, not necessarily kind of engaging with this in a positive way, confusion or so on. And we might actually call this unsafe certainty. Strong procedural compliance, but limited reflection that could push issues underground and maybe cause a backlash that actually causes more harm than good. It doesn't necessarily restore trust if we're just tightening the behavioural policies. We're not trying to understand necessarily what's going on, or how young people are feeling, and then their parents are receiving a letter and so on. And it's not necessarily that any of these actions are wrong. It's that how are they being communicated and how are young people interpreting and understanding them? Because ultimately, without dialogue, explaining what the school knows about the issue, what's being done, and how they will implement the response fairly, students and maybe staff and parents might start to feel anxious or silenced in the safeguarding process. And the students involved might start to feel that they're being judged and will have their own opinion on some of that. So it's about a balanced approach, adding in the curiosity and the care part of the piece. So a more balanced approach might have included some clear, contained communication that's focused on how we're going to support. So not just what the rules are and what's allowed, but what the supportive response is as well. And then perhaps more private conversations with those directly involved to understand some of the context and the emotional impact a bit more. And like with the other example, integration into PSHE once the facts have been established. So the real takeaway here is that procedural action without reflection can create some anxiety. And it's about implementing that explanatory dialogue, the aesthetic attention to how things feel and the tone of the communication, the tone of the policy, the tone of the letter, and the emotional climate that may, then support safety and trust rather than undermine it if people start misinterpreting some of what's going out. Here's a bit the opposite situation. So teachers hearing persistent sexualized jokes, but feeling unsure about where the line is, some of them stepping in, some of them laughing it off, and students notice inconsistency and they interpret it in some cases that the matter is being tolerated or maybe avoided. And this is what we would call unsafe uncertainty. So even the staff don't really know how to react. And as a result, we're not creating that space of certainty. The staff might care about the issue, but lack that shared confidence in the thresholds and the procedures. So the lesson here is that just wanting to act isn't necessarily enough. You do need that strong production domain, that clear policy, definition, the routes to reporting so that staff can feel confident. That relational safety, staff, having a perspective on what's going on isn't necessarily enough. They need that space in place for them to feel confident in how should I react, how should I act. And strengthening those structures enables the compassion that is possibly already present to then become the effective safeguarding that we want to see rather than inconsistent reaction. So yeah, clear reporting, shared understanding developed through training rather than just leaving staff to kind of muddle their way through in their own way. Our final example shows what the domains look like when they're in balance. So a year 10 friendship group reporting that jokes in a group chat have gone too far. And the DSL records the concerns, meets with the students involved, facilitates a restorative conversation, exploring the impact of what's happened and the boundaries that need to be in place for safety, informing the parents of what's being undertaken and why, and integrating the wider reflection on what has been learnt from these processes into PSHE so that all students within the school can benefit from it. So production is strong, everything's recorded and transparent. Explanation is strong. Everyone understands why the incident mattered and has become part of the process of understanding why it happened and how it should be interpreted around safety and boundaries. And the aesthetics is strong because it's based on dialogue and inviting people into a conversation. Empathy and fairness become visible throughout. So this is that safe uncertainty in practice applied across these safeguarding domains. Adults act decisively and they think reflectively. So safeguarding isn't just about punishment or panic, it's about modelling that relational accountability, showing that harm can be addressed through honesty, repair and learning. What's different here with this example is integration. There's procedural clarity, but also shared understanding through dialogue and the aesthetics of care weaving in throughout. And this is what we mean by safe uncertainty in practice. Adults are acting decisively, but they are staying reflective and open to learning. And young people are experiencing protection, but also participation. So it's not just that rules were followed, it's that the relationships are repaired and strengthened. So if we go back to the After School Creative Club that Laura spoke about, we can see within that club that students are being invited to explore what safety means. They created art and stories that revealed the dynamics of safety for them, often subtle. So what's going on within particular corridors, which online spaces feel risky, which adult interventions sometimes feel heavy-handed. And staff are then listening and making those practical changes to how they communicate, to the supervision structures within the school itself. So it's that policy is informed by student insight. It's not just listening to students and going, oh yes, you've had your opportunity to say something. It's genuine participation. And adults are holding the boundaries, but they're open to learning about how those boundaries are felt from young people's perspective. So again, it's that safe uncertainty approach to adults remaining clear about boundaries, but remaining open to evaluating how they go about this in dialogue with young people. And, the teachers that were involved in that really felt that their practice improved. It's not just something we're doing for the students' sake, it's something that actually benefits the safeguarders as well. And overlaying all of this is talking about those who are responsible for the work. Safeguarding is emotionally demanding, is morally complex. Staff described feeling unable to switch off, as Laura outlined, really replaying the decisions in their mind and carrying that sense of personal responsibility for arguably very systemic social and cultural issues. So we have to recognise that support for staff is in and of itself a safeguarding practice, and reflective supervision, peer discussion, protected time for emotional processing are all essential, not necessarily just indulgent extras. So when the adults feel contained, they can provide the containment for the students. If they are feeling like they are being run into the ground and constantly in that reactive state, that is going to affect the aesthetics of how they are delivering their safeguarding and potentially undermining everyone's safety, both their own and the students. So pulling this all together, the bigger project here is ultimately cultural. It's about shifting that culture from managing risk to nurturing relationships. And as I've said, compliance and policy are absolutely vital foundations, but they don't in and of themselves automatically generate trust. And that sustainable safeguarding culture really requires that relational ethics grounded in fairness, empathy, openness, and consistency. And as Laura explained, it was those schools that were embedding that restorative, participatory, youth inclusive practice that reported in the end that greater staff confidence and student trust. And by involving family and community in all of this, as partners rather than as a problem, schools can really extend that safety network beyond the gate. So it's about how can we collaborate rather than how can we control. So it's about that mindset, isn't it, where genuine culture change begins. So to summarize, safeguarding is relational, emotional, and systemic, not just procedural. And compliance means that we can ensure a level of order, but it's that connection that really creates the change. And we're arguing here that safe uncertainty offers that balance of all of this coming together. And emotional containment and supervision is vital to sustain that safe practice. And the youth-led dialogue is really about strengthening trust and creating that sense of shared ownership. So all of this is being conveyed. We have the final report, a link, all of the slides, as I say, in a recording will be sent round to you. The link to the report can be found here, and that provides everything you need to know, much more than what Laura and I have been able to cover in the time that we've had with you. So have a look at that, have a look at more detail, what was found and what was recommended as a result. We are writing about the project and sharing the findings and some of these arguments that we're creating around how safeguarding should look and so forth. So watch this space for when that will all be ready to share with you. Of course, check out everything that the Lucy Faithfull Foundation offers, including their Stop It Now helpline for schools. That's really vital in terms of that direct support for those in this space. And here I have linked to some of what we're developing at Surrey University, looking at safe uncertainty within these contexts of relationships and sex education and safeguarding. And there is already resources and content being developed that some of you might find helpful. So I believe we will now pause there. And we've got 10 minutes left of our time with you. The Q&A is open and available. And Laura has very helpfully posted the report in there, which is fab. But if anybody has got any other questions or comments at this stage, Laura and I are happy to stay around with the 10 minutes that we've got to take that from you all. We know there's been a lot to absorb. Laura, I don't know, while people are writing questions, if there's anything you want to add while we wait.
I think it's just been a real privilege for me to kind of see where we've got to, and I guess really I'd love to thank you, Emily, for that, because I think the schools gave us such rich insights, but then it was your analysis of those insights that's got us here, and I feel like that's really moved us forward a lot. And what I absolutely love is that when we go and share these findings with staff in schools, staff say, yeah, I know we weren't part of the project, but this is exactly what we're finding too. So schools have kind of said, yeah, the schools that you work with represent us, and we feel heard, even though, you know, we didn't necessarily take part in the research. And so what we've been able to do with all of that then is bring it together into a training resource. And, you know, Emily will continue to do lots more writing and research. We'll continue looking at trying to apply that into training resources and resources on the website. So yeah, it's just been a joy to be involved with. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions.
We haven't had anything come through. Dan, I've seen you put your hand up. I don't know if that's to just ask a question outright, which is absolutely cool. I know the recording is still going, but if people want to ask questions, what I'll, just themselves, that's great. And I'll just pause, I'll just stop the recording that ultimately gets shared around. It will be just the talking bit, not any questions that are asked.
Questions. There are
Yeah.
two that have just appeared in the
Oh,
Q&A,
brilliant.
Emily.
Okay.
So, what I won't say the names just for the sake of the recording, but somebody's asked, commented, many thanks for such a great thought-provoking presentation. My question relates to a restorative approach used in schools. I'm a PhD student working on preventing HSB in schools through the use of restorative approaches. And during the PhD, I found a lot of confusion, lack of clarity, and fear surrounding the idea of restorative education in schools. I'd be really interested to find out more about what you mean by restorative in the context of schools and how you see this happening practically. I know your report mentions that schools began embedding these approaches. How did this look in practice? Did you find schools a prior knowledge of restorative approaches? Apologies for the long question and many thanks. No, that's a really interesting question. And I'll just pose the second one as well, Emily, because you might want to dip in and out. I found that some attempts to counter toxic masculinity produce a white knight narrative instead. Can you expand on positive masculinity and how to avoid the pitfalls of benevolent patriarchy?
Oh,
Fabulous
wow.
questions.
They are amazing questions. Wow. Thank you so much. And yeah, Laura, obviously, your thoughts as well. And sorry, I've just realized I said it so that mics and cameras can't be turned on. So I just said, didn't I? You can ask a question if you want yourself, but you actually can't. So apologies
Oh,
for that I misled you all. So you will, if anybody's got questions, whack them in the chat because that's the way of doing it. Or the Q&A. But yeah, absolutely fantastic question. And Laura, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this because restorative approaches certainly do ruffle feathers, don't they? And some people have different views, and the evidence on their effectiveness is kind of questionable or mixed, isn't it? There's a mixed evidence based around it, and I think they can't be implemented as without necessarily that kind of consequence based approach as well. It needs to be part of a balanced approach, doesn't it?
yeah.
So what would you say, Laura?
Yeah, I can totally understand the concerns. And I think that we often think about it in the restorative justice approach, don't we? Where almost that kind of criminal sanctions were avoided if somebody went and made amends for it. And I think that's filtered down into the thinking in schools. And so we have a lot of conversation about this where we want to try and step away from this kind of adversarial victim perpetrator innocence guilt model where restorative justice concepts might kind of fit into, and actually step right back from that and go from a children's welfare and children's rights and safeguarding perspective. So we're not looking at who is the victim, who is the perpetrator, so much as what are the needs of all the children involved, and how can we safeguard everyone. And that's never to lose sight of the harm that's been caused. We have to make sure that we're hearing from the child who's been harmed and what they need to feel safer. But often what students tell us is actually we don't like the zero tolerance punitive approaches because isolating kids for this or giving them detentions doesn't change anything. And what we want is for the harmful sexual behaviour to stop. So the restorative approaches are actually really popular with students because they see that actually asking students to reflect on why did this happen, what needs did this behaviour meet, how can we make sure it doesn't happen again, how can we help everyone to feel safer, will actually produce more sustainable change. And then I think when we start speaking in that language, staff feel a lot more comfortable with it because actually that's where most staff are starting from anyway, a welfare safeguarding perspective. Is that all right, Emily? Did you want to add anything
Yeah, no, I
else?
think I think that's brilliant, and yeah, that's exactly it, isn't it? Because and it was interesting because some students will almost have become so exasperated with what's going on within the school that they can actually start themselves to just say, we just need to exclude people. We need to just crack down on it because it's just not changing and we're getting so fed up. But actually, when you dig beneath some of that exasperation, you find that that really just reflects like having got to the end of their tether. And if we start implementing those more strengths based approaches that look at, well, what do we need to do to repair the culture so that young people are having positive and healthy experiences with one another, then we won't necessarily have to get to that point. of just saying, right, okay, let's just implement the zero tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, great question, and good luck with your PhD, Clara. It's a challenging one, and hopefully you will find some things that are very valuable for us all. And yeah, the other question. So we've got the one about toxic masculinity. Yeah, indeed, the white knight narrative, and I think that actually we see that, don't we, online, and this idea of we're offering a version of masculinity that's empowering, but it's actually predicated on, in its own way, just as much of a restrictive doctrine as the idea that everything's toxic and harmful. And I think it comes back, Laura, you can chime in as well, but for me it really comes back to that strengths based, and we're going to keep saying it, aren't we, approach to masculinity in terms of its openness. So it's about moving away from any of those strictures, and it's about talking about what would it look like to create a space for masculinity that is not bound to any particular way of being. And we can start to learn for ourselves what forms of masculinity are going to work and what feels right and positive for us, rather than, oh, it looks like this or it looks like that, and there's one way of doing it, and this is the healthy and the positive way, and follow these rules for masculinity and you will be fine. And instead it's about starting to look at, well, what are the rules for masculinity? What would we label toxic? What would we label white knight? Where do these ideas come from? And how can we start to break some of them down so that we can give ourselves more space and more flexibility to start defining these terms in ways that are hopefully a bit broader, a bit less reductive? Because actually boys can feel as constrained by the idea that they've got to behave as a white knight as
Yeah.
they do when they hear that everything they say and behave is toxic. What do you think, Laura?
I was just really excited actually to share that I was at a conference this morning, End Violence Against Women Coalition, and Tom from Movember, which I mistakenly thought was all about growing moustaches to raise awareness about men's health, but it is so much broader than that. And they were able to announce some really interesting and what looked to be are going to be great resources that will be published later this week, for boys and young men around positive masculinity. And they've done a whole load of work with influencers and, visible campaigners online to make some really up-to-date modern alternatives to some of these more harmful narratives, and then even harmful counter narratives. So hopefully that might be a good signpost for you to have a look at some great exciting new resources.
Yeah, definitely. I can see it's 5 o'clock, so that was the time we finished. But we do have one more question, so it might be worth us just answering it. I know obviously people are going, but at least we've got an answer on the recording for you all. So we've
Sure.
got, and this opens, actually, this is such a big question to answer because it really tapped into our findings, didn't it, Laura? So do you find that educators are looking directly to social work to take a lead on this approach due to pressures on education resources? And yeah, Laura, I can imagine you could speak a lot about multi-agency public health experiences, can't you, from the project?
Yeah, it's so tricky, isn't it? What I did find was, which was really refreshing, was that agencies weren't embedding into their own position and blaming everybody else, which was really nice. I think schools recognise the huge pressures on social care, sometimes experience frustration when they feel a threshold is being met and it isn't in the view of social care because they've got another 100 cases that are higher. Um, and then social care recognising that sometimes schools are seeing a different perspective to them, they're operating within different constraints. Where's the role of health at the same time, and how do we get, and the police, and how do we get everybody working together? So I guess I didn't really find that schools were looking to social work to take a lead on it. I felt like schools wanted to play an equal part, recognizing that they've got the eyes on the children most days and they know the families, so they've got some vital pieces of that puzzle, wanting to work with the statutory agencies so that they can do the bits that only the statutory agencies can do. Um, but yeah, really mixed picture depending on geography and depending on thresholds and depending on funding challenges. But generally, I was encouraged to find that there is a real genuine commitment between the agencies to try and work better together, notwithstanding all the barriers that we know about that come up in every serious case review and that don't get any easier to overcome, but hopeful and optimistic in the way that people are talking to each other, I think.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Like I think taps back into that explanation domain of safeguarding. That there was that real desire for that multi-agency partnership approach, not kind of outsourcing or shifting
Hmm.
the responsibility. But because, like you say in the question, there's pressures on resources, and
Yeah.
also schools were just feeling that they weren't necessarily always going to be able to solve all of these problems alone. They recognise the limits of their own ability, right? They were saying we're part of the picture, and there's all these other parts of the picture as well, and creating that shared understanding of the roles and the responsibilities, and all singing from the same hymn sheet is really part of that explanation domain of safeguarding. Not just do the students and the staff, are they on the same page, but also are the staff on the same page? So yeah, that's a really good question for sure. So I think we can call it there. So thank you for those of you who are still on the call. Thank you also to those of you who will be listening to this recording after the fact. We're really grateful for your time, and we really hope that at least some of what you've heard today has been valuable to you, and at least maybe now you want to dig into the report a little bit more and consider some of these ideas. Do stay in touch with us. Any kind of questions or ideas or whatever comes to mind for you, we're happy to hear from you. So yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I think people are people are dropping off. So
Yeah.
I will close the meeting now abruptly for those of you who are still here. Goodbye
Bye.
to you all.
Bye.